tried to do both at the same time. Okay, there we go. All right, so let's take a look at this. So just take a second or a little bit more than that just to read over the first sort of set of information, I guess, that's given to you. And then we can talk about what we wrote for question 1. All right, so there's not much info given there, right? And so remember too, you want to answer these questions really just based on the information that's given there, right? Instead of looking ahead. It's okay if like what you suspected here doesn't ultimately end up being what it is, right? That's totally fine. It's not like a wrong answer in that case. All right. So for number 1, why doesn't somebody share what they wrote for this one? I think this one's pretty straightforward, probably. We probably all put the same thing. Somebody want to share? Zoom or live, one of you guys? What'd you put for number 1? Alicia.
I put, she's a struggling artist, and usually struggling artists don't make a huge amount of money, and she might not have access to healthcare.
Because of that, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seems like it could be a money issue, right? And so that's one of the barriers that's keeping her from going to her routine healthcare visit, right? Okay, did anyone have a different answer? A different answer for that? Sorry, Zoom people.
I said
Different answer for that, or no? Did we all kind of put something like that? Jesus, what the hell? I probably broke it now. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. It's back. All right, so for the second one there. Whenever I tip it up, it's too heavy that way. Ay, ay, ay. For the second one, what did you guys want to share what you put for that one? So there's probably a couple different answers for this one. I'm not going to touch it again. As long as you guys can hear and see the screen. Go ahead. Tell me your name again. Joya. Joya. All right. Go ahead.
I said that you could have a problem with cocaine, like use of cocaine that causes the sinus problems.
Okay, so you chose cocaine because of the sinus issues and the sores around her mouth. All right. What else? Did somebody choose another one here, given this limited amount of information that it gave you?
I said also, when I looked like some other questions, I said like Julia, cocaine exposure, different drug use, alcohol exposure, and also said like maybe secondhand, like air pollutants.
Okay.
Sinus issues.
Okay. Yeah, could be. But given that, yeah, given that information, you know, that limited amount of information, you kind of could come up with a few different reasons, right? So that's fine. So as long as, you know, if I gave you a question like this on the exam, as long as your reasoning makes sense, then it would be fine, right? What else? What are some, I mean, there's another probably kind of bigger one that most people might have put down. Alicia.
I put it might be an STD.
Okay. All right. That's, yeah, same thing. And you don't really know anything, right? So you're just kind of going based on the sinus issue and the sores on the mouth. You know, like somebody in my other class said, oh, well, maybe the sinus issue could be due to inhaling, you know, paint thinners and stuff like that if she's an artist. And then, I don't know, and then you can kind of come up with some explanation for the sores. So you can really kind of, because they don't give you much information, you can kind of come up with a few different possibilities here. But what's another big one? Nobody had another one?
Can you have
Had another. What about you guys on Zoom? What else did you have for this one? For number 2?
I was gonna ask if you could have sinus problems.
What'd you write down?
Cocaine.
Oh wait, Christina, are you talking? Sorry, oh, wait, I gotta turn my volume
It's okay.
up. Go ahead.
Can you have sinus problems from a cocaine use? Because if they're, I don't know if they're inhaling it.
Yes, for sure. Somebody already said cocaine. What else? What's another one that you might have put down?
Can't you also have meth? Isn't like meth sores a big one?
Yeah, sores. Yep.
And also, I know like it doesn't say much about what kind of sores it is, but I know if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, that can interfere with your sinuses. And if sores, I wasn't sure if it's like cysts kind of sores. I know if people are drinking a lot, their hygiene might be off and everything, so it could cause hormone reaction to get sores around their mouth and everything.
Yep, I think that that's a legitimate explanation as well. Did anyone put tobacco use? I mean, that could also result in sores in the mouth and maybe what seems to be a sinus problem, right? Because maybe it's affecting respiratory, but maybe, I don't know, right? All right, so anyway, the point is you could have sort of had multiple answers for number 2, because it gives you limited information. Okay, and that's fine as long as you are your rationale is fine. Then that's great. All right, we move on. Okay, so let's move on here. All right, so number 3 asks about risk factors, right? So based on what's here, what would you consider as risk factors in this case? What'd you say? Did you say something? Okay, what'd you say? Okay, good. Yeah, alcoholism and what? And also drug use in our family. Yep, family history of alcohol use and drug use. What else? Yeah. Yeah. Yep, good. The physical, sexual, and emotional abuse that she experienced definitely could be a risk factor. I mean, often when somebody's abusing some sort of substance, right? It's to compensate for some emotional issue or something like that, right? Or psychiatric illness, right? So those are definitely all risk factors as well. What else? Anything else? Smoking. Yep. Okay. All right, that's good. Yeah, you're right. Given like her sort of lifestyle and the history that she gave, right? Depression could be an issue, and that could be the underlying psychiatric issue, which probably also complicated with some other psychiatric issue as well. But yes, that's good. What else was another risk factor? Say again? Yeah, peer pressure. What were you gonna say? Yeah, so somebody said cigarette smoking already, but yeah, you're right. That's definitely a risk factor, right? And remember we talked about too that you often like there's that comorbidity between smoking, right, and psychiatric illness in general too. So again, all these kinds of things sort of fitting together. All right, so if we move on to number 4, now this is asking specifically about during the physical examination, right? What findings during that physical examination would cause you to suspect that Ms. Hernandez's substance use may be more than she described in her history? What do you think? Yeah. Okay, good. Her eyes were glassy. She wasn't able to sit still. What else? Somebody on Zoom want to say something?
How she got, how she reacted to the questions and how defensive she got.
Okay, that's good. That's a good one. Say it louder. Yeah, and so what physical things gave you that impression, right? Yeah, good. All right, good. What else? Anything else you guys put there? Okay, all right, let's move on to the next set of questions here. All right, so just take a minute or two just to read over that, and then we'll talk about numbers 5 and 6. Okay, so number 5 says, what complications of cocaine abuse did Ms. Hernandez exhibit in the emergency department? So I guess if we go, yeah, in the emergency department, what do you got? What do you got going on there? What did you guys write down for this? Okay, so yeah, so the seizure, right? What else? Okay, right, dilated pupils, right, confused, yep. What else? Yeah, nosebleed, hypertension. Yep, go ahead. Yeah, correct. And then the cardiac arrest. Also, if you guys look up, oh, we're going to talk about that next, I guess. That's what the next thing talks about. So just a couple of things. You know, it says suspecting a drug overdose from an unknown substance, the paramedics administer naloxone, right? So why did they do that? So do you think naloxone would do anything to reverse the effects of cocaine? But would it do any, would it have any effect on with cocaine?
Isn't it for opioids?
Yeah, it's for opioids, remember, right? So naloxone is specific to an opioid overdose, right? So if it was a heroin overdose, sure, that would help, right? And would reverse the effects. But here, it didn't do it, right? It didn't help. Remember that naloxone actually binds to the same receptors that those opioids bind to, right? And so it sort of blocks the effects. Cocaine doesn't bind to those same receptors, so that wouldn't really do anything for this, right? But it was a drug overdose, they suspected it, and so that's, you know, they're gonna give that right away in case. But then it says here, she begins to seize and benzodiazepines are administered. So why'd they give those? What do benzodiazepines do? I guess what, I can ask it, I guess more specifically, what neurotransmitter do benzodiazepines increase essentially or sort of interact with?
Is it dopamine?
Well, probably indirectly, but let's think about primary effects of it. So think of another one. What's the neurotransmitter that's mostly, in general, inhibitory and will sort of slow down and inhibit the central nervous system? You guys remember the name of that one? Yeah. Gabrielle, say it louder.
GABA.
GABA, right? So benzodiazepines are gonna, so if we talk about a seizure, what's a seizure? What happens during a seizure? Yeah, too much stuff going on in the neurons. That's a good way to describe it, right? There's increased activity of those neurons. They're firing when they really shouldn't be, right? And so it's an increase in activity. So increasing GABA, which is inhibitory, will bring that down, right? So that's why you would give a benzodiazepine following a seizure. Make sense? Right? So these are things that we want to, you know, think about and be able to reason through. You guys, everyone all right with that? Yeah? You guys on Zoom okay with that? All right, now let's talk about number 6 here because that's kind of where I was going to go next. So number 6 says, what pathologic effects of cocaine on cardiovascular physiology led to Ms. Hernandez's cardiac arrest? So if you look at something kind of that happened earlier, right? What do you think? What's going on with this? What led to the cardiac arrest, I guess? Yeah, irregular heartbeat, right? If you look up at the top, talks about ECG here, right? Showing that dysrhythmia. And what does an ECG show? Yeah, I mean, but it's an electrical trace of that heartbeat, right? And you're right. You can look at that electrical trace, right? And you can see, you know, when are the ventricles contracting, right? When are the atrium contracting? When are they relaxing? And that tells you about the sort of the function of that heartbeat, right? And the function of the heart. So you basically had the effects of cocaine, right? Inducing that dysrhythmia that ultimately led to cardiac arrest, right? This sort of it changing that function. Anything else you guys, what did you guys write down for that one, for number 6? What are some things that you guys wrote? Anyone want to share what they wrote? Right, so if you look at the book's explanation for number 6, they get pretty, I guess, I don't know, I guess it's kind of technical. All right, so it's listing a whole bunch of stuff. your question, your answer probably wasn't that detailed, right? That's okay. Cocaine causes increased sensitivity to catecholamines, causing tachycardia. So what's tachycardia? Yeah, right?
Increase of heart.
Increased what? Heart rate. Increased contractility, right? With increased myocardial oxygen demand. Tachyarrhythmias, we already talked about that. That's what you were seeing on that ECG, right? Elevated blood pressure. All of these things basically contribute to cardiac arrest, right? All right, so like I said, I wouldn't be expecting you guys to list all of these things, right? A sort of a general answer like I kind of gave before would have been sufficient, but I always like to kind of pull up what the book thinks is the answer. Sometimes they're really good and other times they're kind of like, eh. But anyway, questions about this case study, guys, right? So there's definitely a lot of information in this case study that I pulled out, right? So even if I put up, you know, say, let's see, let's go back. Right, so like remember when I was just asking you guys about naloxone, right? And what effect that had in that case. We should be able to answer those types of questions. So like I could use the same text, but ask you different questions like I asked you guys just a few minutes ago. Okay, does anyone have any questions about anything from chapter 6 right now that you want me to go over more? So otherwise we're gonna move on to chapter 8. All right, so here's what we're gonna do for anyone, you guys on Zoom, you guys have any questions? No? Okay. All right, so here's what we're going to do first. Everyone should go and get the review sheet. I'll show you where it is. I think I kind of already showed you guys. For chapter 8, for exam 2, right? So exam 2 review sheet, click on it and have it available. We're basically going to add some definitions to that review sheet for chapter 8 first, and then I'll pull up that PowerPoint and we'll go into that PowerPoint, okay? If you don't, I mean, I'll pull it up on the screen. So if you're in class and you don't have your computer, I'm gonna pull it up on the screen. You can just write notes in your notebook, okay? So as long as you have something to write on, you'll be fine. You can also do this together with one of your friends. Just don't get too close to them. And you know, because I'm just gonna ask you guys basically to kind of look up and Google some of these terms. All right, that's what we're gonna start with. So let me pull that up. That is right here. All right, so if you guys, ooh, that's really big, huh? We probably don't need it that big. All right, so if you look here, this is the beginning of chapter 8. So basically, there's a whole bunch of terms that are listed here. You know, these kind of, as you can pretty much figure out what these mean. Not really that hard. So it looks like a lot, but it's not really that much. And I think these are really short, just require really short definitions. The ones that I definitely want you to start with are these at the top here. So electrolyte homeostasis, metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis, respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, okay? But basically we wanna define all of these. So when you guys submit that completed review sheet, I'll look to see that you have all these definitions there. But let's start doing this right now, okay? So the other thing is too, if you come across sort of associated maybe causes or symptoms with some of these, jot those down too, okay? But I'm really just kind of looking for basic definition. All right, so you guys can look it up yourself, talk to each other, whatever you want to do. I'm just going to give you guys like 10 minutes or so, maybe not even 5-10 minutes, just to get some of these terms written down, okay? All right, guys, let's just talk about some of these. So, like I said, these guys, hyponatremia, we'll talk about those towards the end of the chapter. There's also a lot more terminology that's introduced in this chapter as well. So, thought it would be nice to just kind of like go through some of these first. So first of all, for electrolyte, what did you guys write down for a definition there? What do we mean by electrolyte? What'd you put for that? Anyone? Somebody? Go ahead. Say it louder. Or that has a charge, I guess. Okay. What else? What's another? What does somebody else write? Yeah, so correct. So in water, electrolytes will dissociate into ions. So that's what I guess that's what your definition anyway meant by charge, right? So what are some examples of electrolytes in our body? Some examples of electrolytes? Name one. Name an ion or an electrolyte in our body.
Potassium.
Sodium ions. Okay. What else? What'd you say?
Potassium.
Say it louder.
Potassium.
Potassium. Good. What else? Chloride. Calcium. You just look at these here too, right? Magnesium. Okay. So these are all, I mean, sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, phosphate, right? Magnesium. These are all types of electrolytes or ions that we're going to talk about, all of which will affect your physiology. Yeah. So I guess that sort of brings us to homeostasis. Obviously, a super general term there, right? I guess as it refers to electrolyte and fluid balance, what do we mean by homeostasis? Yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of fluid and electrolytes that needs to be maintained within the body, right? That sort of internal steady state. You can think of that in terms of body temperature, right? In terms of fluid levels, in terms of electrolyte levels, in terms of acid-base levels, okay? So when you think about homeostasis, super important, right? And there's tons of mechanisms that your body has to maintain homeostasis, right? So for us, for this chapter, we're focused on homeostasis of fluid and electrolytes, okay? And you guys just named some different electrolytes, okay? All right, so now what about these terms here? So metabolic acidosis and metabolic alkalosis. So let's take metabolic acidosis first. What did you guys write down for that? Usually you kind of find just a general kind of like, okay. And you have a little more for that? What do we mean by the acidosis part of it? Good. Okay, so an increase in H plus, right? Hydrogen ions will lead to what? What's the acid part of it mean? A decrease in pH, right? So we're talking about acidosis, okay? We're talking about like blood pH levels. They're going to decrease, and it's due to some metabolic issue. Now, some examples are like in diabetes, right? You have like diabetic ketoacidosis, right? So it's or due to some other nutritional deficiency or something like that. So that's where the metabolic part comes in, okay? But the acidosis means that the pH of the blood is lower. So what about alkalosis? What's that? Increase in pH, right? So when we say something's alkaline, it's basic, right? Increase in pH. What's the normal pH of your blood? 7.4-ish. Okay. So why is it so important that the blood is maintained at a pH of 7.4? Or is it? What can happen if the pH of the blood is either too acidic? Well, one, it's life-threatening, guys. Like all of these things that we're talking about in this chapter are like super serious, right? So if you talk about acidosis or alkalosis, right, it can be life-threatening. So why? It does, correct, right? If it's going to be too acidic or too basic, right? It's moving away from homeostatic levels. Go ahead. Okay, why though? What does this affect pH? Correct. It's going to affect organs, but let's go deeper or smaller.
It affects your CO2 and O2.
So correct, CO2 or increase in CO2 levels will actually decrease the pH. That's especially when you think about respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis, that has to do with CO2 levels. But why does a decrease or an increase in pH, why is it dangerous? What do you think? Think about inside the cell. So they're, right, proteins, enzymes, they work at a specific pH. If the pH is changed, those enzymes, those proteins can denature. So even think about protein like hemoglobin, right? That carries oxygen around in the blood. If the pH of the blood is changed, it can cause that protein to denature, won't be able to carry oxygen around, right? If you think about enzymes within the cell, they won't be able to function to carry out the reactions that need to happen, okay? So you can kind of just, it's kind of there's other effects as well, but kind of all these other effects that we kind of think of are a result of those changes in the protein or the enzyme. Okay. So did anyone kind of come across any sort of causes of, I kind of gave some ideas about metabolic acidosis, some causes of metabolic alkalosis. Did you come across that when you guys searched? Anyone? What'd you find? Not respiratory, but what about metabolic alkalosis? No, you didn't come across. Okay, but you're right. I'll come back to you on respiratory. Okay. Anyone find anything for metabolic alkalosis?
It said that anyone with a reduced ability to excrete excess acids. So I guess if you have something wrong with your kidneys, you can't filter
Okay.
out the
Good.
extra stuff.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, a kidney issue, right? Renal issue. Also, excessive vomiting can lead to metabolic alkalosis. Okay. So there are a couple other causes that you probably can come across, but excessive vomiting is one. All right. So now if we go to respiratory acidosis and alkalosis, what causes respiratory acidosis? Say it louder. Hyperventilation, right? And then what about alkalosis? Might have it backwards. So respiratory acidosis, is it hyperventilation or hypoventilation? Hypo? So if we're talking about acidosis, right, increased levels of carbon dioxide will cause that pH to decrease, okay? So hypoventilation would lead to acidosis, okay? Hyperventilation would be the opposite, respiratory alkalosis. Now, sometimes like if you have metabolic alkalosis, you can then sort of hyperventilate to sort of compensate for it. So the metabolic acidosis and alkalosis kind of sometimes interacts with the respiratory acidosis and alkalosis just to kind of overcomplicate things. So just so you know, sometimes that's a compensatory mechanism, right? To make up for that change in pH that occurred, okay? But when you're talking about respiratory, it has to do with hyperventilation or hypoventilation, okay? And the idea that increased levels of carbon dioxide, okay, will decrease the pH and make it more acidic, okay? So if you have increased levels of carbon dioxide, right, because of some respiratory issue, leads to acidosis, right? If you have lower levels of carbon dioxide, too low levels of carbon dioxide in the blood, it's the opposite, okay? It would be more alkaline or the higher pH. Now, the reason why I'm spending a little more time on these is because I'm not going to cover chapter 9, right? So chapter 9 is acid-base imbalance, right? So within unit 3, let me pull up the, we could go over these real quick, but then I'm going to pull up the lecture because I just want to kind of just talk about a little bit about the relationship between sort of the pH imbalance and the electrolyte fluid imbalance. So here, what do we got? Hyponatremia, what's that? What do we mean by hyponatremia? Hypo means what? Too little, right? Too little what?
Sodium.
Sodium. Too little sodium where? What's the emia part mean? In the blood, right? So decreased sodium levels, right? What about, hyper, increased, hypo, decreased, right? So hypernatremia, increased sodium levels, hypo, decreased sodium levels. Simple as that. These are super easy to define. What about hyperchloremia? Elevated levels of chloride. Thank you. Hypo, decreased levels of chloride, right? And we can go down the list if we want, but I don't think it's necessary. Kalemia is referring to potassium, right? Calcemia, calcium, okay? Phosphatemia, phosphate, and magnesium, okay? So too high levels or too low levels. All right, so I expect that you guys have definitions for all of these. And again, for the 1, 2, 3, 4, what is that? The first 6 up to respiratory alkalosis, you should have some more written there, okay? Okay, maybe an example, right? I went through a couple kind of causes. So it's just maybe a little bit more written for those. These are super easy just to say increased levels of sodium or decreased levels. I'm not really worried too much about these, okay? All right, so kind of what I was saying, if we go back, or if I go to the PowerPoint, so I'm in the chapter 8 PowerPoint, okay? Doesn't really matter. So this is a chapter overview, guys. This figure, sorry if it's a little blurry, but I had to kind of pull it from the e-text and like do a screenshot and then crop it, so it's not the best because they don't, for some reason, they don't provide me those figures. But this is really the Unit 3 overview picture, okay? So remember, Unit 3 is fluid and electrolyte imbalance, which is chapter 8, and then it's also acid-base imbalance, okay? The two of them influence each other. So if you have an imbalance of fluid and electrolytes, that's going to also affect acid-base, okay? And vice versa. All right, so that's why these are sort of together. And if you guys take a look at this figure here, again, not the clearest, this is giving you, some examples of acid-base imbalances, to which I listed these terms on that review sheet. We already went over these. And then you can look at some of the sort of symptoms that arise as a result of some of these here. Okay, so on your own computer, you probably can look at this. It might look a little bit more clear. I also added this link down here because this refers to these ABGs, right? So what does ABG stand for? I don't know. Do you go through this in your nursing? What are you guys in? Assessment, nursing assessment? Did you talk about these or no? Blood gas, right? So if you want to learn a little bit more about these, so arterial blood gas, right? Because we were just talking about what? That carbon dioxide levels will influence, right, the pH of the blood, okay? So if you're going to take an arterial blood gas, it's going to tell you oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, right? And there's a laundry list of reasons as to why some of these can be off. But so anyway, that link is in the PowerPoint if you're interested. Okay, so again, if we look at this overview here, right? We talked about homeostasis already, okay? Maintained through consistent fluid and electrolyte adjustments. That means, and this is true for any level in the body. It's not just like it's like set there and then that's it. Your body doesn't have to do anything to maintain it. Your body is constantly working to maintain those homeostatic levels. And we'll talk about some of the mechanisms that maintain fluid and electrolyte imbalance, okay? So for some of the systems that are involved, right, renal system. So what do we mean by renal? Kidneys. And what's the functional sort of unit of the kidneys? What'd you say?
The nephron?
Nephron. Yeah, nephron, right? There's millions, right? Over 1 million nephrons in each kidney. That's where all of this function in terms of maintaining is happening, right? Other hormones, and there's also, and neural function is going to come into play too. We talked about hypothalamus a lot, right? Hypothalamus controls the endocrine system, okay? So that's primarily what we're talking about there. But there's other, I guess, neural inputs to kind of maintaining this homeostasis as well. Okay, so again, electrolytes will dissociate into ions and water. We already talked about that. In terms of fluctuations in fluid, meaning too little water or too much water, right? Which then affects electrolyte levels as well, can lead to cellular changes, can alter the electrical potential of cells. So what do we mean by that? This one here. Electrical potential of cells. What are we referring to there? What cells in particular, you think? I mean, all cells have an electrical potential across their membrane. But what cells specifically generate action potentials and rely heavily on sort of electrical activity, I guess?
Neurons?
Neurons, good. What's another cell type that this is true in?
Would it be like cardiac tissue or?
Well, correct. Cardiac tissue, right, which is muscle, right? Cardiac muscle tissue, super important. Also skeletal muscle tissue as well, okay? And then it says here fluid shifts. This is just referring to the fact that if that imbalance is off, it's going to it's going to cause fluid to move into different compartments. And we're going to talk more about that. And then again, we talked about this, right? Alterations in pH. The fluid and electrolyte imbalance will cause alterations in pH. pH changes in pH, like we just talked about, will disrupt the functions of enzymes, right? And then also can lead to cell death, cellular injury as well. Okay. All right, guys. So let's kind of move on here. Where are we? Okay. So this is sort of the intro to that. You know how we have those same figures in every chapter where it's like that, not a flow chart. What the hell do you call one of these things? This thing. What do you call this kind of chart? What is that called? I don't know. It doesn't really matter, right?
Flow
But
chart?
anyway. What is it?
Flow chart maybe, or like
Maybe,
a concept
I don't know.
chart?
I don't know. Regardless, we always have one of those in every chapter. So this is just intro to that. So in terms of fluid in the body, right? So this is kind of broken up into two main parts here. General effects of sort of fluid levels in the body, and then general effects of electrolyte concentration, okay? And to which we're going to talk a lot more about, okay? So if you look up at the top, the first one says workload of the heart. Okay, so I just gave you some examples as to how this might affect workload of the heart. If you have an increase in fluid, right, in general, it, sorry, it's not supposed to be and, that's a typo, causes an increase in blood pressure. So increase in fluid, meaning increase in blood volume. Think about that, right? Do you guys agree? If you talk about like a blood vessel, think of it like a hose, right? If there's more liquid or fluid in that blood vessel, right, it's going to lead to more pressure, increased blood pressure. The more fluid that's in that vascular system is going to require the heart to work harder to basically move that around, okay? Also, if you have a deficit in fluid, right, a decrease in fluid, the heart's going to try to beat faster to compensate for that. Both of those things are going to increase the workload of the heart, okay? In terms of vital signs, there's going to be multiple vital signs that are going to be affected, right? Increase, decrease blood pressure, whether you're talking about an increase in volume or a decrease in blood volume, increase or decrease heart rate, so et cetera. There's many other ones that we can kind of add in there, but those are a couple examples. Also, another big thing that we're going to talk about in this chapter is edema, okay? So maybe you guys learned how to assess for edema, did you? So how do you do that? Yeah,
It's supposed to.
Press on the skin, right? And how do you determine if there's edema or not? Say louder. Right. So if the indent stays, what does that indicate? That there is fluid or not? What happens if there's excess fluid? I guess that's my question. What do you see on your assessment? If there's excess fluid? Okay. All right. Whatever. We're not going to go through clinical assessment, but I would think that if there's excess fluid, right? Would it stay indented, or that's if there's a decrease in fluid? Okay. So we can assess for edema, right, by doing a little palpation of the tissue, I guess, right? Bottom line is, if you think about an excess of fluid again, right, in those blood vessels, if there's enough in there, what starts to happen is it starts to leak out. Not the blood. The blood never leaks out of the vessels unless you cut it, right? But fluid leaks out, okay? And that's what leads to edema. That edema, and we're going to talk about different types, it could be in different places, right? But essentially, it's just this excess fluid, okay? And then also, if you have excess fluid accumulating in the lungs, obviously it can lead to problems with oxygenation. Okay, so these are just some general effects. If we talk about electrolytes specifically, okay, electrical signals, we already said that. What electrolytes or ions in particular would influence electrical signals the most, you think? Out of those ions that we kind of talked about on that review sheet, right? Which one do you think is going to be, maybe there's two that are predominant here that I'm thinking of. What did you say? Sodium. And what's the other one?
Potassium?
Yeah. Sodium and potassium are going to be the ones that are most, if levels of sodium and potassium are off, those are going to be the ones that will most contribute to the electrical signal issue, okay? This obviously concentration of electrolytes will also affect cardiovascular function. One, because the heart is a muscle, right? We just talked about that. Things like calcium, though, levels will be really important in muscle contraction as well. Okay, so we can bring calcium into there too. If you look here in terms of, concentration of electrolytes, there are normal levels, right? Remember we just talked about those terms, hyper, hypo. Okay, we'll talk about them again. But here are those normal levels, okay? Nobody needs to memorize or anything like that, or measure. If you look here, this serum osmolality, what do you think that refers to? And don't worry about the units. You don't have to. If this was like in a class on, I guess, lab test, we could talk about that more. But let's just look at the levels here, and let's talk about this. What do you think this is? Serum osmolality. What do you think that tells you? Yeah, who said that? Well, it's like little voices. I don't know who said it. Yeah, all of them combined. It's the idea, because again, remember, the levels of electrolytes in fluid are kind of work hand in hand. So overall sort of levels of electrolytes, this is what this is going to tell you, right? It's also going to tell you about how much fluid is there too, right? Because if you have higher osmolality, that means you're going to have lower amount of fluid, okay? So yes, you're right. That's everything all together. So that's another sort of term kind of thrown out there, yeah? Okay, that's that. Okay, here's our whatever the heck kind of chart you want to call it. Also, there's a little more information about metabolic acidosis, respiratory acidosis, right? Metabolic alkalosis and respiratory alkalosis we talked about. So remember, I said on that review sheet, you really should, elaborate on these definitions. We're not going to talk about these in really much more because we're sort of skipping chapter 9, right? So that's the reason why I don't cover chapter 9 in total, because I feel like we hit on some of the main concepts. So I sort of leave that out so we can move on to some other topics. But if you guys look, again, you can see that fluid and electrolyte balance and acid-base balance are right next to each other. They're going to influence each other in a really strong way, okay? And then you guys can see those sort of main concepts that are closer to the center, and then some of the other sub-concepts out to the sides there, okay? I don't know, I mean, again, we can see, if we talk about perfusion, right, we can see those things that are related to perfusion there, okay? Elimination, mood and affect, intracranial regulation, so shows you things like lethargy, right, seizures, coma, okay? These all can result from acid-base or fluid and electrolyte imbalance, okay? All right, questions about that, guys? All right. Okay, so the first part of this chapter is more general, all right? It's going to talk about general concepts in terms of how fluid and electrolytes are regulated, talk about osmosis and osmolality a little bit, talk about hypertonic and isotonic and hypotonic solutions, and then the second part of the chapter then talks specifically about, all right, what happens if you have too little sodium? What happens if you have too much sodium? What happens if you have too much potassium? To the point where you're going to be like, oh my God, we got to look at another one of these. So that's the way the chapter is set up. Okay, so the first part of this talks about something called total body water. And so it just means exactly what it says, right? How much of your total body is water, okay? So it varies by age, also varies by the amount of fat that you have. So because fat contains less water than muscle, right? So a lean person would actually have a higher percentage of total body water, right? Not total body weight, total body water. Also, younger individuals will have higher values as well, okay? So in a 70-kilogram adult male, about 60% of total body, right? Total body weight is water, okay? So 60%. About 70%, so it's higher for newborns and for infants. Okay, when you talk about total body water or total body fluid, you can basically kind of divide that across two categories, and then the one will be subdivided, okay? Intracellular fluid means exactly what it says. It's the fluid inside your cells, okay? Extracellular fluid is the fluid outside of your cells, okay? Like I said, this is divided up into three subcategories. If you notice, intracellular fluid takes up more or a higher percentage, or it's the largest portion of that total body water, okay? So most of your water in your body is contained within the cells, okay? But there is also fluid, there is also water that's outside of your cells and the extracellular fluid as well, okay? So if we now, I already said this, I guess, right? If you look at the intracellular fluid there, now, don't get confused with these, because I'm going to show you a picture next and you're like, what? If you're talking about the percentage of total body water, so we said the percentage of your total body weight, right, in a 70 kilogram male is about 60%. So if now you just look at the water and you look at what's coming from intracellular fluid versus extracellular fluid, about 70% is intracellular. I told you guys that, right? Most is going to be inside the cells. And then about 30% is outside the cells, okay? Now, why do you think I put sodium here next to that extracellular fluid there, or outside cells? Anyone know? So sodium ions are present at much higher concentrations outside the cell, okay? So if you talk about fluid levels outside the cell being off, that's going to greatly affect sodium levels, because there's lots of sodium outside the cell and there's lower concentrations inside the cell. We'll leave it at that. Okay, so if you now divide up the extracellular fluid, okay, there's three other compartments that you can divide it up in, okay? So intravascular, this is talking about inside your blood vessels, right? Inside the vascular system, whole blood, right? It says blood plasma, lymph, right? So anything inside a lymphatic vessel or inside your blood vessels. That's what we're talking about here, okay? Intravascular. Here, interstitial component, this is the fluid that surrounds cells, right? So this is in tissues, okay? And this is essentially how nutrients, right? Oxygen, things like that are transported to your cells. Remember, the blood never leaves the blood vessels, right? Oxygen, nutrients, they get transported across the blood vessel, right? In the capillaries, across the membrane. They end up in the interstitial fluid, and then your cells can take those in, right? Same way if you're talking about waste products. Cells will release those waste products into the interstitial fluid. They can then be picked back up into the blood, right? And then be transported out, okay? So that's the interstitial component. But then there are also some other sort of defined components that contain fluid, right? It's kind of special fluid. So cerebral spinal fluid, where do you find that? Yeah, where else? Yeah, in the brain, right? So you have those three layers, those meninges, and cerebral spinal fluid flows in between them. And it kind of acts as a shock absorber, okay? But it also helps sort of nourish the brain tissue as well. So it flows all through the brain. There's this ventricular system. Also in the spinal cord as well, right? So if you're going to get a, I don't know, spinal tap, right? What are they, or they suspect, somebody might suspect you have meningitis. What do? Take a big giant needle, right? And they go down pretty low, because at a part of where your spinal cord is actually not there, where they can pull out that fluid, right? It's cerebral spinal fluid. Also, there's fluid, right, in like synovial joints and stuff like that. And also other body cavity fluid as well, okay? So that's the smallest component, this transcellular component. So this is just a figure here. And again, what this is showing you now, this is showing you total body weight, okay? I was kind of talking about total body water and then percentage from there. So just don't be confused by this. This is saying that intracellular fluid makes up 40% of your total body weight. If you look here, this is, again, showing you that 60% body fluid. This is that total body water that I mentioned on that other slide, okay? 60%. And then it's just showing you those other compartments. I mean, don't go memorizing this figure or anything like that. It's probably easiest just to look at those last two slides. But this is essentially showing you what I just talked to you about, okay? All right. I'm probably just going to go a little further because I'm going to go back to my office and I'm just going to record this anyway and put this up for you guys. So I guess we can go through this part here maybe and maybe a little bit longer, and then I'll let you guys go, and then I'll go and record it, and I'm just going to post it up on Moodle for you. So osmosis is written there. So what's osmosis? Did we ever talk about osmosis? In like, I don't know, probably in anatomy and physiology maybe. Yeah, maybe. How would you define osmosis, I guess, in simple terms? Say it louder. Yeah, the movement of water. But it's particularly the movement of water across the membrane. Okay, so again, when we're talking about biology or physiology, we talk about the movement of water across the plasma membrane, right? Across the cell membrane. So it says water moves from less concentrated to more concentrated areas to equalize concentrations. So I won't even go there. I don't really like this figure, but we're going to talk about it in this way. So when it says less concentrated, it means less concentrated in terms of like electrolytes, meaning there's going to be more water there, but less electrolytes, less solute. Okay, so water is going to move from where there's a lot more water to where there's less water, right? Or from an area where it's less concentrated in terms of, say, sodium to an area where it's more concentrated, right? Because it's going to try to equal out or level out essentially the concentration of that solute, okay? Now, why do we talk about this and talk about osmosis in biology and physiology? Because water readily crosses through the plasma membrane, okay? And water and the movement of water is going to influence the function of the cell, right? So if too much water moves into a red blood cell, what will happen? It can burst. That's it. Cell's not going to work anymore. What if too much water moves out of a red blood cell? It'll shrivel up, okay? So this is why it's so important to maintain fluid and electrolyte levels, right? I mean, even if you just think about that red blood cell and how it's going to act or what's going to happen to it when it's placed in a solution that has a whole bunch of solute, right? Or in a solution that doesn't have enough, right? It's super important for it to be maintained, okay? So that's what this is showing you here. Again, here's your higher concentration of solute, like sodium, right? But a lower concentration of water, right? Here's a lower concentration of your solute, like those dots are sodium, right? And a higher concentration of water. When we just talk about basic diffusion, right? Things move along their concentration gradient. You guys agree? Water does the same thing. So, but if you're just talking about movement of water, right, or osmosis, that's what it's showing there. So you can kind of think of it in two ways, right? You can think of it as water moving from where there's a lot of water to where there's a little water, right? Or you can think of it as water moving from an area where there's less solute to an area where there's more solute, okay? And that's what this is saying up here. Less concentrated in terms of solute, like sodium, to an area where there's more solute or it's more concentrated. Okay, does that make sense for everyone? Okay. These guys probably can't even hear, I don't even know. All right, so now if you want to talk about the movement of the solute, because yes, ions still can cross through the plasma membrane through channels, right? And so they will move based on their concentration gradients as well, okay? Just like water will. And that's going to, again, influence electrolyte and fluid levels, okay? All right, so diffusion in general is just, we're going to consider it as movement of solute, okay? Like sodium. So what do you have here? You have, like, here's your little sodium ions, right? They're moving from high concentration to low. So think about from outside the cell to inside the cell, right? Again, ions like sodium cannot just cross through the plasma membrane on their own, okay? They move through channels. Water moves through a channel as well. Things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, what about those guys? How do they get through the plasma membrane? Anyone know? Is there a special channel for oxygen? They just diffuse. They can readily cross, right? So oxygen and carbon dioxide just readily diffuse across the membrane. There is no special channel or special mechanism or anything like that. So when you talk about like oxygen moving from the lung, right, into the capillaries that surround the lungs, it's just diffusion, just moving from area of high concentration to low concentration. Ooh. All right. It's probably I'll do 2 more slides because the next slide is like a little annoying. You probably have to listen to it twice. So active transport, we've probably heard of this before, it requires ATP. So this is basically showing you if you're going to move an ion or another molecule against its concentration gradient, meaning it's moving from a place where there's low concentration to high, it requires energy, okay? So an example is a sodium-potassium pump. Again, we don't have to get into that, but there is a sodium-potassium pump that operates on every single one of your cells, and your cell pours lots of energy into that to help maintain that membrane potential and to help maintain the proper concentrations of sodium and potassium. If that doesn't work, basically you die, but those levels are all thrown off, okay? All right, so this is gonna be the last thing that I cover, because like I said, this may require a little bit of kind of thinking about it and listening to it a couple times. Now, and I don't want you guys to get lost, I guess, in these details, but I think it's important to mention this. So this is, again, it's talking about movement of body fluids, right? And remember, we talked about those different compartments, right? There's fluid in your blood vessels, okay? That moves out into the interstitial space. There's also fluid in the interstitial space that moves back into your blood vessels, right? And so what this is talking about is how does that happen, right? So you kind of have 2 types of pressure that are listed here. So something called colloid osmotic pressure or oncotic pressure. And this basically is pressure that's due to the presence of proteins, okay? Proteins, big proteins like albumin. We'll just leave it at that. Hydrostatic pressure is pressure that's exerted by basically just fluids and their properties when they're at equilibrium. So you can think of like fluid and sodium concentration, okay? That's what's going to influence this hydrostatic pressure. Now, if you talk about, so let's go here. So capillaries. What's the function of capillaries and where do you find capillaries? I kind of mentioned a little bit, I guess, of the word. But where are capillaries, or what happens in capillaries, I guess? Why do we have them? Gas exchange, yep, and other nutrient exchange as well, okay? And so this is giving you a little more explanation in terms of how gas exchange or nutrient exchange happens, meaning how come things that are in the blood, right, like oxygen and say glucose, are able to move out of the capillary at some point, but then in other parts they move back in, right? Waste products can move back in. And so it has to do with this sort of difference in pressure. So it says here, there's higher hydrostatic pressure versus colloid pressure at the arterial end. So what do we mean by arterial end, or what do we find in arteries? If we just think about gas, right? When you look at a picture, aren't arteries usually red? Why? So they got oxygen, right? And veins are what? Are blue, because they gave away their oxygen and have oxygen, right? So if you think about the arterial end where there's lots of oxygen there, it's going to move out, okay? And the reason why oxygen will move out is based on the difference in these 2 pressures, okay? When you talk about the venous end, again, where you're not going to have a lot of oxygen, okay? The reason why things move back in there is because of the fact that there's a lower hydrostatic pressure versus colloid pressure at that end, right? So again, like I said, this is kind of like a lot to sort of take. So if you look at this picture, that's what this is showing you here. Now, right, this is like physics. There's a lot of stuff going on here. To get into it in any more detail is definitely beyond the scope of this class, but I wanted us to kind of just understand that it's really just based on this difference in pressure in terms of things moving out of the capillary and then things and those waste products and carbon dioxide coming back in, okay? And it has to do with this oncotic pressure versus the hydrostatic pressure. So I'll tell you, if you talk about like malnutrition, right? And you have a decrease in protein levels in the blood, it's going to affect that oncotic pressure. And it will alter this mechanism, okay? So the levels of proteins in the blood affect this process, okay? So that's something to kind of keep in mind. So when we say oncotic pressure, it has to do with or is influenced by the level of proteins, okay? So that's why, when we talk, you talk about, like metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, if you talk about a severe protein deficiency, it's going to introduce some of those issues because of changes here, okay? All right. The next part of the lecture talks about edema and different types of edema. All right, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end here. Like I said, I'm going back to my office. I'm going to record this whole lecture, and I'm just going to upload it for you. The PowerPoint that's up there is pretty much updated. I may make a few updates to the end of it. If you guys want to kind of sit here and you're just jotting down notes and going through the PowerPoint a little bit more, that's fine. But I'm going to go and I'll put up the whole lecture, okay? Yeah.
So on the review sheet, it says for the like you want the electrolyte imbalances and then all the signs, symptoms, diagnosis, causes, and treatment for chapter 8.
Where are you referring to?
Electrolyte imbalances.
Where is it?
Go down a little bit.
Oh, yeah. So you'll see that's basically the end of
That's all those definitions and then you just want us to add.
well, kind of, but I'm going to go through all that in the recorded lecture. That's the end of the chapter. It's basically there's a section on hyponatremia, hypernatremia, and it talks about it goes through all of those things in each one of those sections. Does that make sense? So instead of me listing every single ion, I just put it in there like that. Does that make sense? Like I said, I'll go through this in the recorded lecture. It's towards the end of the lecture. And then I do refer to a bunch of figures in here. Those are all in the PowerPoint as well. I pulled, I think, most of them in. I think I have a file where there might be PDFs of some of these figures, but I'm pulling them all into the PowerPoint, so everything's right there. Okay. All right, guys. So if anyone has more questions, that's fine. I'll hang around. But otherwise, you have the textbook, get reading or keep reviewing that lecture. So Monday, case study chapter 8, and this review sheet needs to be completed, okay?
So what's on the screen right now? So that's the what I downloaded at first.
Correct. You are right. Yep. That's what we were working on first in the beginning of the class. Yes.
So so I know that we definitely have to answer those definitions, but are we also doing that bottom part?
Yeah.
what we handed?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you should be writing
Okay.
in your notes there too. Yep, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Sure. Let me stop recording.